Welcome to Reading and Writing Between the Lines, a podcast series about communication skills in the workplace. I'm your host, John Witzman. Join me as I speak with industry professionals and Conestoga faculty and alumni to explore their journeys with reading and writing skills. Follow us as we talk about how communications learning has changed over the years, how these skills are used in a wide range of industries, and the future of workplace communications. I'm here today with Ariana King, Project Manager of Toronto Shelter Support Services at the City of Toronto. Welcome, Ariana.
Hi, John. Thank you so much for having me today.
We're thrilled to have you here to talk about the many ways that you use communication skills in your career. Perhaps you could just get us started by telling us briefly the nature of your work for the City of Toronto.
Yes, I'd be happy to do that, John. So yes, as you mentioned, my name is Ariana King, and I'm a project manager for the City of Toronto. And the department was previously Shelter Support and Housing Services. And so what I specialize and focus on in that area is leading project management initiatives for large-scale strategic transformation within emergency shelter services and housing initiatives for the City of Toronto.
You said a few key words there that made me think that we have so much to discuss in terms of communications, a strategy, transformation, these initiatives that no doubt require a great deal of coordination between people from various departments. But before we dive into that, I was hoping to take you back to your early days of education so that you could paint a picture for us. What was it like for you when you first began to learn communication skills, reading and writing in your education?
Well, going all the way back to grade school, elementary school, John, I feel like I was always a very curious person and child. So learning reading and writing in school was actually quite challenging for me. Had a lot of reading and writing focus in the home. So it wasn't the reading and writing itself that was difficult. It was the fact that I wanted to ask questions about everything related to what I was being taught about reading, writing, and communication more generally. I was never the type of student to just sit down and do what they were told. I always wanted dialogue. I think that was a really big part of my early and ongoing experience with communication in general. And what that looked like very early on is I would have a lot of questions. So that was part of being curious. And it was very difficult for me because it was not well received, I think, by educators early on. It was seen as, in some cases, quoted as being disruptive or confrontational or challenging to authority to be asking questions about what I was being taught and being curious about why we were being taught certain elements of, for instance, cursive writing was something that I learned back in the days. I'm sure many people did.
Yeah.
I understand it's no longer being taught now, but
it's coming back.
Is it coming back? That's so interesting. Yes, an old school classic art. But I would say, yeah, it was very difficult to learn how to communicate in a classroom environment for me. Very different from my home setting, which questions, reading and writing were highly encouraged. So I often got in quite a bit of trouble in school in terms of communication.
Thank you for sharing that with us. I'll try not to take you too far back into unpleasant territory, but it's so fascinating, isn't it, to imagine something like curiosity, something like the desire to engage in the conversation and participate. Hallmarks of good communication that we would recognize now, that those would have been coded or received as insubordinate or uncooperative in a previous generation of education, and I can completely picture it. Yeah. Was there a time when you remember that starting to shift, that you recall your curiosity, your natural curiosity, getting embraced and valued at school?
Yes, and it wasn't until I paid for my own education, John. Right. So post-secondary education, but all the way through public education, I would say that remained true. There was a strong discouragement for dialogue between educators and students. But as soon as I got into university, I continued to do the same thing I did, which was be curious, ask critical questions.
Right.
and I received scholarships and award for it. So that was the first time in my life in an educational setting it was truly celebrated, embraced, and that I received accolades for it. So I would say to any student out there that had similar experiences to me, never give up the curiosity. As Albert Einstein said, it has its own reason for existing.
That's great advice, and absolutely, you're right that the lesson there for other students is that there will be a time and a place when it's valued and rewarded. I'm curious to know, though, that's a long time to wait to see it pay off, for lack of a better word. Although from the sounds of it, there were some material gains as well. I wonder what you must have been thinking as you entered into the sort of high school stage of your education, and you're starting to think about career tracks and making some long-term choices. Were you starting to think maybe I have to go in a particular direction that away from communications related work, because this is how I'm being received? Was that starting to shape your decision making?
It actually did. And it's funny you say that, John, because before I went to university, I actually went to college for media and marketing sales. I was always quite interested in marketing, quite good at sales. And I thought, speaking was always something that I was quite good at, communicating with other people. So I thought, if questions would be discouraged, maybe the more valued part of communication, which is talking to people, at people. That was what was modeled to me in an educational environment. Someone speaking at you, you taking it in. So I thought if this was the model going forward, so then I did pursue a different career path and went to college. It was absolutely not for me. I would say my curiosity was stifled. I continued to ask more critical questions. And that is just not, again, in a sales environment, it just did not align with my fundamental values. Mm-hmm.
It sounds like your career path is a rich and interesting one that I want to explore. But before we start to get into the career portion of your story, I want to just stay a little bit longer on the sort of educational stage. And I'm really interested in how your curiosity manifested itself outside of the classroom. You've mentioned critical thinking a couple of times and critical questions. Do you recall making notes in the things that you were reading? Were you directing that curiosity to the text and making little questions and comments and notes on the paper? Is that something you recall doing?
Absolutely. Yes. I did that a lot. Also got in trouble for that with the librarian, because a lot of times they were books from the library and I would have little Post-it notes in it with lots of notes that I would forget to pull out. But there was always things I wanted to circle back to. I never really took anything at face value, which is something that I learned is what critical thinking is when I was in a post-secondary environment. But yeah, again, very highly discouraged in grade, middle school, and even high school. But yes, lots of notes. I always wanted to circle back, follow up. And I was always very interested in stories. So I was quite good at history and quite good at English because there was an ability to storytell and to listen to other people's stories. And I feel like that also is a good method of communication. So fiction was something I was very drawn to as well.
Absolutely. That's, I think, an interesting way of framing note-taking, right? Is making a story or a narrative out of the ideas that you're hearing in whatever context. Certainly, if the context is already a kind of narrative, like history or literature study might be. But do you recall feeling good about the notes that you took from class when you sat down to study for an exam or prepare for some kind of assessment that required you to go back over the previous week's learning? You felt like the notes gave you a clear picture and told a clear story that would make that sort of retroactive learning process feel like you were on solid ground?
I do, in a lot of ways, Sean, and especially when it was a story, it resonated with me more. I was able to retain a story more, and then the note taking was more in terms of questions. And those questions about a story helped propel my thinking to go a little bit beyond the question that was being asked
Right.
in an exam, in a test. And so I'd often get bonus points because I
Yeah.
would go a little bit above and beyond based on those notes and those queries where I was positioning a framing of an answer in relation to the narrative that was being told and really being able to draw connections throughout similar themes,
Yeah.
throughout areas in academia, through different subject matter. And really, I kind of see it as like a weaving together of a cohesive narrative and story in different subject areas.
Absolutely. I'm so interested in this, and I'm wary of getting too technical here, but I want to probe just a little bit further because I think as you start to describe it as almost a material act, right? The weaving together, I think, is a lovely image that allows you to capture a moment, to retain a moment, and then bring that forward with you. It's an incredibly powerful skill, and so. I think that it's really worthwhile to dive into the nitty gritty of a person's thinking and note taking techniques. Can you paint us a picture? What were the tools of the trade? Did you have highlighters? Did you have the multicolored pen with the 4 clickies? Did you sort of develop your own style for how you laid out the information on the page, or were you using an actual sort of note taking style? Tell us more about what that.
It didn't begin that advanced, John. My
Okay.
father was very big, very invested in my education. So I did have all the highlighters. I did have all the stickies. I tried to use them, but honestly, I always went back to basics. I would have a pencil and my own notebook, and I would pull out excerpts, quotes, themes, and I would take my own notes on the side in addition to a good old-fashioned Post-it note that I would plop on the page. And after I was finished reading an entire page, this was also something I learned that was very valuable. I used to try and take notes and understand what I was reading by reading one sentence at a time, taking them in and going on to the next. And then I actually learned that for me personally, it was more difficult to retain the entire narrative and theme. So what I eventually learned to do was read everything over once, even if I didn't catch everything the first time, and then read it again. But interestingly, I learned later in my career that that is actually the most effective method to retain information, especially in high volume. So when
Absolutely.
in college, like college students know, or in university, there's a lot of material to get through, and to have to go line by line. I used to highlight after one sentence. I'd be like, "Oh, this
Right.
is an important sentence."
Right.
But then I read a few sentences down, and I'd be like, "Actually, this was the important sentence."
Yes.
So reading everything, read one page fully. That's what I learned to do at a good old fashioned pen and notebook. And then it evolved. And when we discuss my career now, I can share with the students some of the more advanced tools and technology that I have at my disposal now to make that more efficient. But
Well, that seems like a great place for us to sort of jump forward in time, and maybe you could connect your current work to some of those specific skills that you're talking about. How do you? I know that we want to get into a little bit of the journey as well, because I want to know how you get from media studies and sales to public housing, shelter support services at the City of Toronto. But it seems to me that in public service work that you're describing, this strategic initiative-based work that you do as a project manager, there must be so much demand to read and retain the salient points of a high volume of information, probably documents that are really dense, policy, language, et cetera, and then a real requirement to be able to ask critical questions in the moment, and of a document. So maybe you could try to make that connection for us. How those skills you developed in your education days are paying dividends for the work you do now.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that, John. Let me go all the way back to where we
Please.
started this conversation.
Okay.
Curiosity. To me, communication is comprised of really 3 core themes for me personally that I use in my career now. The first is curiosity. be curious genuinely about whatever it is you're engaging in, because when you're curious, you will be naturally compelled to ask questions. And when you ask a question, be prepared to accept the answer that is being given to you. And what I would say that second theme is active listening. And then the third piece of that I use is the oral communication skills, which then you would go back to someone after you listen to what they have to say. You would ask additional clarifying questions, which is, to be honest, usually always necessary, particularly in my profession and career. It's the 5 whys. You know, if you ask a question 5 times, you will really get to the root of what is being discussed. And then being able to reiterate what you have understood back to your audience. And that is what I would call synthesis. So when you're able to be curious, ask questions, actively listen to the answer, process that, you then take that and I synthesize that down. So my own understanding in that moment, then I would reiterate it back and say, okay, John, I understood it to be X, Y, and Z. Is that accurate? And then the subject matter expert or the stakeholder or the person that you're talking to, because this also applies to family, friends, it doesn't even have to be professional, can confirm if that was an accurate understanding, if you captured their perspective. And then you can leave any conversation, interaction, dialogue, or debate with kind of the trifecta of what I value in terms of communication. Lead with curiosity and compassion. Be open and active in your listening, and reiterate and confirm your understanding.
I'm tempted to model what you're talking about now and repeat back to you what you just said, but I think I got it, and it's really useful advice, and I think really clearly and expertly communicated. I love the way you've broken it down into a kind of sequence like that. Those elements of a communication process. There's so much there for us to dive into in terms of making connections to the kinds of skills that we might work on at a post-secondary communications course. I'm curious to know, though, if you felt like you always had this approach, or if those principles got developed over time. Do you recall maybe an early experience in your career where maybe you didn't repeat back to somebody that synthesis of what they said, and it turned out you misunderstood, or they you hadn't connected? What was that like?
You have to learn some things the hard way, John. So early on in my career, of course, I was intimidated when I was, first starting off as a professional, potentially. And there were more senior people that were directing work and asking me to do a thing and to develop a product or a material. And I took it at face value, and I didn't really interrogate it. I maybe asked one clarifying question if it was really obscure or really not clear. But I really learned quite quickly to ask questions like, who is the audience? What is the intention? Who is it for? And what is it that we're trying to say? What do we want people to understand? And I would say that in terms of public policy and administration, particularly in the area which I work, and I would say to anyone interested in this field, on the social service side of things, if you're ever working with people. So public administration, it's a very big field. You could work in corporate services and have a lot less stakeholders or different kinds of stakeholders, but these skills ring true across the board. If you are being asked by a teacher, by a friend, or by a professional, your direct report to do something, always ask the question of, what is it for? Why are we doing it? What is its purpose? And where is it going to end up? And then through those, the what, where, when, why, and how do you deliver it? I think those very basic questions that we all learn really will set you up for success. And so the first time I learned that the hard way, I spent, let's say an entire week working on a product. I put a lot into it. And then it turned out it wasn't, it didn't meet the need. And so I wasted my time and I had to go back and do it twice. So I don't like touching things twice. And I would say if you ask those questions up front, you rarely will have to.
It's amazing to hear you use the words audience and purpose, because these are fundamental concepts in most post-secondary communications courses. And I know that my colleagues' ears are burning right now as you make those connections. It's, I think, a really revolutionary is a strong word, but it's a profound observation to make. I think that perhaps is easier for people to make when they're perhaps farther along in their careers, to realize just how important those foundational concepts and foundational skills actually are all the way through. That the concepts and the skills that might get introduced at a preliminary level in a first year post-secondary course, it's not that they're simplistic; it's that they're essential, and that they're foundational all the way through. You can get very far with a strong commitment to those core values of approaching every task with an understanding of, or a desire to find out, who is my audience, what do they need from me, what's my purpose, how will I know I've achieved it, right? These core concepts. I'm curious to know, in your role as a project manager, do you see younger people entering their professional lives, having not yet mastered those skills? Do you see now, from your vantage point, people trying to figure that out in real time, and what does that look like from your perspective?
Yeah, I'm definitely happy to share. In my profession, and I have a background in policy analysis, so coming from the policy perspective and now project management, what I can say is, even myself, coming from academia, you start your career off. What I would say is I see a lot of people entering public administration, the field, and the work is very good. I mean, smart people, competent people, students that have PhDs come in. What I've learned over the years, though, is, and what I did myself when I entered my profession, is there was a lot of content. There was a lot of thinking, let's really articulate this. Let's really build it out. Let's put a ton of detail into it. So, for instance, being asked to write a briefing note or writing a policy paper. These are tools that in public administration are absolutely essential. Writing authorization memos. The truth is, public policy and administration as a field and a profession is really, to me, the collection and organization of a large bodies of information, and the organization and the ability to synthesize complicated social issues and large bodies of information and work into simplistic and organized archives in a system, whether that be at a municipal, provincial, or federal level, several of which I worked at, is to set up decision makers to be able to effectively make decisions for how to allocate limited public resources to solve complex social problems. So, being able to produce information, circling back to your question, John, it is really hard to synthesize, the issue. So in my case, the issue of homelessness and the issue of a mental health crisis, an opioid crisis, and a housing crisis converging at one moment in time, creating a plethora of extremely complex systemic issues. And it is really hard to draft a one-page briefing note with 10 points that captures all the information that potentially city council would need in order to make a decision on how to spend millions of dollars to support people in the community. That is actually a skill. And I would say that it is really challenging because it is easier when you're dealing with so much information to include a lot of information. So I see that a lot with people entering into the career. And I think over time, this is really something I would encourage any student, even in academia, synthesize, draft it out, go back over it, pare it down again. And then if you keep doing that exercise in your mind on paper, you'll be able to flesh out what are the most salient points that your audience, and this is where we come back to those basic and essential questions of like, who is the audience? What is the intention? And what is the need? So in my case, what is the need? Are we dealing with the refugee crisis? Is there translation services that need to be, is it a warming center that we need because it's winter months? What do people need to know to make these decisions? And how do you synthesize that down to a few bullet points on one slide in a PowerPoint presentation? That is a skill that comes with practice.
With practice. And so, first of all, Ariana, I want to congratulate you because that was, I think, a really, really insightful observation that could be of a great deal of value to somebody starting out in their career, and so succinctly express that idea of organizing and synthesizing and making clear, complex and dense issues that certainly have the potential to be explored in volumes and volumes of books, but in the context of a public service professional, a policy support worker, especially somebody who is at the early stages of their career, where they're working to support decision makers, where they're trying to provide information that gets funneled into a larger conversation. It's a difficult but crucial understanding to make, and probably one that one can't necessarily make until they've maybe failed to make that connection. First, you have to, like you said, you have to kind of make some mistakes to learn from it. But this is a concept that we've heard from other people too, that we've spoken to on our podcast in different fields, right? In business, in particular. We've heard from guests talk about how important it is for them to consolidate their thoughts and to be concise, and how hard it was for them to do that, and how much coming back to the end of your point, how much practice it took to become really skilled at emphasizing those core concepts, whatever they might be. In whatever context. I'm really curious to know a little bit about your practice. The development that you took to get to a point where you could understand this was the goal and that you could achieve it. Do you remember? Was it school assignments that gave you a word cap, or was it early work projects where a manager gave something back to you and said, gave you direction about less? Can you remember what some of those sort of points along the way were like?
Yeah, I would say in academia, we always had word counts, but I don't think the word counts, it definitely helped pare things back, but I don't think it gave me the honed skill of synthesis. I would say I was able to cut things out, cut things down, but a word count doesn't emphasize the key takeaways necessarily, because a lot of the times essays, post-secondary, like standard academia literature, you always know you have an introduction, the thesis, the beginning, middle, and end. I would say the same can be said in different fields, sometimes in public policy, but it is really the product in public policy is what's going to define the flow of the work. So a briefing note, for instance, is you have the purpose up front, then you have maybe 2 to 3 bullet points of background at most, then you have several bullet points about the key issues, and then you have options and recommendations for decisions for a decision maker to read. And at most, this is going to be 2 pages, 14 bullet points on complex issues. So although academia did help me bind potentially a volume of work that was being produced, it didn't necessarily help me hone in on the different kinds of products that would be required in this field for decision making. I would also say the other thing that academia was great for, but that didn't translate into this field, was presentations. So in academia, we always had a time count on presentations. It was to share a concept and idea. And you always knew what the purpose was because we had a curriculum to follow. So that was really helpful. And in academia, everything is very, very structured.
Right.
That's what I would say. College, I went to college, so I can resonate with college students, but also I went to 3 universities as well. So this, it gives us a lot of structure. I would say that is not necessarily true in public service, because there is a ton of structure, bureaucracy is very structured and there are policies and protocols to follow. But when you're dealing with emergency services, which is the area in which I specialize, in public safety, you have a lot of emergencies. And in an emergency, and when you're dealing with society and members of your community and people in general, the need is constantly changing.
Right.
And therefore, we have to adapt. Unlike in academia, a curriculum, if it works, we stick with it maybe year over year. But in public service, the need could change from one month to the next. And certainly resources change. We could have some more, and these days we don't. It's always less and less. So the resource context can change and the need can change, and therefore the products and what you're being asked to produce will also change. So there is a great deal of need to be adaptable. And for me, myself, it was really only until I stepped in my career and I had to test things out to say, you know, if my manager or a director was like, I want to know about this, I had to, through trial and error, truly, John, is this a one-page literature review? Is this a 5-slide PowerPoint presentation? What would be the best way to get this information across most saliently and most concisely so that the decision makers above me have accurate evidence-based information to make informed decisions? And then that goes up the line to assistant deputy ministers, or in the case of municipal governance, city council, general managers. So really through trial and error. But what I would say to people is, getting into this particular field, maybe there are a lot of things academia helps me with, but it will be through practice in your career in the area in which you work in public service that will really help you hone these skills.
I think that's really important advice, and it's advice that we've heard again, repeated in some of the conversations we've had in this space. That concept of trial and error, of practice, of repetitions. That the skills that you're talking about here, the ability to synthesize, the ability to assess ideas and information on the fly and make decisions about what to keep and what not to keep, that really advanced a skill set gets developed only one way, and that is over time through repetition, through practice that we start in a structured way in our schooling with scaffolding in place, right? We establish those structures that feel maybe at times rigid because they're there to provide support, guardrails. And then eventually we get to the point where we don't need them anymore. We push against them and we find we're standing on our own 2 feet, and then we have to develop those small twitch muscles. We have to develop the ability to respond to the unexpected. And again, cycle after cycle, over time, you get to the point where you can make those decisions on the fly. It's perhaps, and I wonder, I'm always curious to know how people at the earlier stages of their careers might feel upon hearing that kind of wisdom, because it's there's no shortcut in that particular piece of advice. I wonder though, maybe there's reassurance in hearing stories, anecdotes. Do you remember an aha moment where you felt like for me, the movie reference is Keanu Reeves in The Matrix when he says, I know Kung Fu, right? And he realizes he can dodge the bullets. Do you remember when you realized you knew sort of communications Kung Fu?
Yeah, I would actually say I do. And it was in my first experience with the provincial government. I was in the Ministry of Community Safety and Correctional Services, and very privileged to work on a small policy team that was undertaking a legislative reform for correctional services, so the prison system, and bringing segregation in line with UN standards. Okay. We had to do a lot of stakeholder engagement. So what I would say, John, is everything we've talked up to this point, particularly in current, very written communication focused.
Right. Okay.
Developing written. This is where I think I would like to shift and share the story and the aha in terms of the oral communication skills and how you
Absolutely.
pair those together. So, of course, we went out to do stakeholder engagement. And I recall I was doing an engagement with Métis partners. So we had to do a lot of Indigenous engagement, as and the Indigenous community are overrepresented both in correctional services and certainly now in homelessness disproportionately. And so when I was sitting with community members and listening to their stories, it was an aha moment for me that I could, number one, listen actively. I always knew this, but to really make a human-centered connection in this work. And then to be able to reassure community members that like what they were saying mattered, their experiences counted. This was not just a checkbox exercise.
Right.
And it was an aha moment for me in the sense that I think it brought everything together in the sense that I would take those stories back and I would, very honorably, to the best of my ability as an ally, transpose that into a written word.
Right.
Which takes a lot of responsibility and trust from members of our community, but also to really understand that the work that we do is very people-centered, and that being curious and listening and hearing people's stories is more important than what I thought I knew about being a subject matter expert.
Right.
Because I think also coming from academia, or if you have a very high skill set in a certain area, a lot of the times, and I can speak for myself, John, like I would think, well, I'm an expert in this area. So sometimes going into conversations, I would think I already had the answer, not at the forefront of my mind, but I realized maybe that would happen sometimes subconsciously, where you think you know the answer and you're asking the question to maybe validate your own understanding of what you already know or what you want to hear. And I would say that this is really where active listening comes into play. And for the Indigenous partners that I've had the privilege to work with over the years, sitting in discomfort. Sitting in discomfort is really important, particularly with, that's true also for refugees, members of the Black community, hearing difficult stories from the clients that I served, and knowing that it was going to be my responsibility to honor those stories and do what I could, not to advocate, because that is not the role of a public servant, but to shape a narrative in a way that is reflective and authentic to the experiences of the people that we serve. That's when I knew that I could do this job very effectively, John, because I knew I had the writing, I knew I had those fundamental skills, but the storytelling and appreciating the storytelling, and when I say storytelling, that is people's own experiences, sharing their thoughts and feelings about the work that was being done. And being able to really truly receive that, I think brought it together as a whole picture for me, that it wasn't just about being good at writing. It wasn't just about asking the right question. And it wasn't just about listening to the answers. It was about how do you pull that together, going back to the idea of weaving concepts together that is evidence-informed, based in academia, but based on lived experience and that truth as well. And then putting those things together in a salient, synthesized, and concise way for decision makers. And then I think that was my aha moment where I was like, this is going to be a promising career.
I can see it. I love that example for the way that you illustrated the connections between the different modes of communication, that idea that the skills you developed, or the skills, maybe the inclination that you had naturally to be curious, how that allowed you to be sort of a critical questioning reader, and that allowed you to have to develop a rich skill set in the written word and a subject matter expert, and then how that allowed you to be a more active and engaged listener when you were in these situations with real people, and realized that, and you could connect really deeply to the things that they were telling you about their lived experience, and you could almost respond to their messages, their communication in real time, as if it was a text that you were as if you were reading it, and then that would then again inform your writing and make your professional writing more meaningful and more informed for having had that interpersonal connection. And so to illustrate in that example, the connectivity of those skill sets, and to help perhaps illustrate to somebody at the beginning of their career or in the educational phase of their career to realize that the learning they're doing right now is one cycle, but then those cycles sort of inform each other, and they cycle up and up and up over time, and to the point where it can be really, really rewarding, like you just described, that feeling like, yes, I'm meant to be here. I can do this well. I can do something meaningful and valuable that will help people's lives in a lot of profound ways. Which brings me all to the question of what's coming next. How is a field like yours that is on the one hand, being part of a large bureaucracy, but on the other hand, rooted fundamentally in people and serving people and improving people's lives and meeting people's needs. How do you see that work changing or being affected by this sort of tidal wave of technological change, artificial intelligence, social media, communications, videos everywhere? What does that look like in your field?
It's a great question, John, and I'm glad you asked. I'm going to answer that in two parts. First of all, current state and what I've seen even in the last 8 years of my career shifting, and that would be the social media aspect of it. So especially when we're dealing with very high profile social issues, so homelessness being the area in which I work now, and housing, it is what we call a hot button topic. Everybody in this country, in this province, in this city has skin in the game. We are renters. Everybody, most of us who are fortunate, live in a home. We understand what it would be like to lose that housing, potentially, to be at risk of housing, to struggle with affordability. So I would say from that perspective, in this particular context, there's a lot of advocacy happening. And what I've seen over the last 5 years in this particular space is that, Twitter, so things like Twitter, right, social media, counselors, city councilors who are in the municipal context, the ultimate decision makers of policy and processes and budget approvals, they will be contacted directly through social media by large advocate bodies or just individual bodies of advocates who have very legitimate concerns and have very legitimate questions about what is government doing? Is it enough? Is it the right decision? Are we investing in the right things? People want answers. People are demanding action. And as you said, it's a large bureaucracy. There are many checks and balances. That is why it is so large. That is why it is so slow, because every penny has to be accounted for. Privacy, legal, procurement, it is public money. So there is just a massive amount of oversight that has to be built into the bureaucratic system. From that perspective, circling back to how it's changing now, I would say that advocacy is definitely putting a lot more pressure on political decision makers. I've also seen in this particular space, workers, frontline workers, managers of frontline workers who are out on the streets engaging in this work. They're also being captured on cell phones and potentially being doxxed. That has happened before. There is a lot of, there's a high profile exposure and what we call in this field, very focused public optics. So optics, something that, government is not as overly aware of as a private body, but it is certainly impactful because it is to serve the community. So if the optics are bad, and government does not have public relations built into it, we couldn't justify that as a cost, and it's kind of the same way the private market does. So to maintain credibility, to maintain trust with the members of the community, which is required for people to come out and vote and also make informed decisions about democracy, we have to be responsive. And so there has been a shift to try and, not necessarily, the social media game from a government standpoint, I would say is a government social media will never be fun and sexy, but it is certainly informative, concise, and, has really tried to come into the field and respond to questions and concerns. I would say, though, it is now, I've seen in different areas working, in different communities, it can put a lot of pressure on certain decisions being made when counselors are coming under pressure for it. And I would be wary and cautious in terms of advocacy really focusing or forcing narratives in absence of evidence. So, in public policy, it's evidence-based decision-making. Everything has to be backed by facts, by lived people's stories, by what academic literature has shared, by what we know to be true to the best of our knowledge. And so when people have a perception of how bad things are, so panhandling is a good example in homelessness. When people see people on the street asking for money and they see more and more of that, there's a perception that homelessness is increasing and that's a bad thing and someone needs to go out there and do something about it. So from that perspective, I can see social media is putting a lot of pressure on decision makers to go one way or the other, or to focus on certain areas over the other. I wouldn't necessarily say decision makers succumb to this, but I would say that it is an increasing area of pressure, and public optics is being considered more in this context than it has been historically.
So if I'm to use your technique of reporting back and synthesizing, you might advise to aspiring public service and public sector professionals, coming up through the system today, that even though social media is adding dimensions and dynamics to the complexity, to the already complex landscape of public policy, despite that, what might feel like a temptation to sort of bring the public policy discussion entirely to a social media realm, the answer is to actually entrench in the skills that you were trained in, and really know your subject matter, really know the evidence, and try to bring the conversation to a place of informed understanding, to try to harness that attention and steer it back towards a conversation that's really steeped in the full breadth of knowledge and evidence on that topic. That it's a way into the conversation. But I can imagine there's a temptation to get pulled into the social media arena. But it sounds like good advice to try to use that perhaps as an invitation to bring more people to an important civic discourse, but to then harness that discourse to evidence and informed discussion.
And absolutely, John. Similar to Twitter, I would say, a very strong skill set in this field is you need, I guess, what in private sector they would call a soundbite. So there's a lot of buzzwords in government, and when you're speaking to someone or you're communicating something complicated, people will typically latch on to what we refer to as the elevator pitch, right? So can you explain something complicated in 2 minutes? Because as we know, most people are only going to you will have their attention for maximum 120 seconds, 60 seconds in most cases. So can you, what it is you would like them to know and understand concisely, clearly, and with being informed. Be informed, be concise, be clear. So I would say that social media has also, with I think 140 character maximum on Twitter, apply that to what you're trying to say to people. And when you're asked to do things like speaking notes for mayors or ministers, like I have, they will want to take that one point across, because you do not have people's attention. If social media has taught us anything, there's a very short attention span in our culture these days. So you need a narrative that will get people's attention, but that is informed by evidence wholeheartedly. I do want to touch very briefly on the AI piece as part of the discussion, because I think that this probably resonates a lot. We did not have ChatGPT when I was in academia.
Yes.
I understand that that's a thing now. And actually, I understand even in government, some people can leverage it. FYI, that is not endorsed. Absolutely not.
Right.
I understand that ChatGPT, from my research on it and from my colleagues who do work in AI spaces, can be very helpful to do things like draft emails potentially. And, ChatGPT, as an example of AI, has the ability to synthesize what you're saying very effectively. So it does that exercise that we were speaking about earlier of synthesis, which takes maybe some time, practice, and intention. That can be done in a second. So there is benefit in that. But what I would say is, because of the accountability and procurement processes with government, technology is very slow to be adapted. Innovation is very slow and cautiously adapted in government because there is so much accountability, oversight, and transparency required with public money and decision making that we are very selective about the technology that is invited in. There are many, many privacy concerns working in people's services with people's information, sensitive information, that we cannot let external cloud-based software, third-party, have information related to people's information. So there are privacy and legal concerns abound. I would say even if government did get there, let's say in 15, 20 years, they're like, yep, we're going to introduce AI, we're going to have technological advancements. It will never replace stakeholder engagement skills, John.
Right.
It will never replace the need to go out to community members and have really difficult conversations about what it is that is happening, their perception of it, and what the need truly is, and how what we have been providing is being experienced. Right. AI will never be able to replicate that, not at least in my lifetime. I could be completely wrong, but I suspect thinking forward into the future, even if we adapt to technology in 15, 20 years, the need for the human-centered approach will remain.
Ariana, I'm so grateful to you for sharing that insight in particular, because I think it's a really important message for us all to hear, but certainly for people who are aspiring towards a career in the public services sector, to understand that this skill set of interaction with people, and to be able to listen and understand and synthesize both the lived experience of individuals and the evidence and the best practice that they're reading in the literature. That combined skill set is always going to be essential and a foundation of what makes them successful and happy in their work. Is I think a really, really important message to hear. And of course, it totally fits, I think, with the the full picture that you've shared with us today in terms of your experience in your career. Thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing these insights into your journey with these skills and in your work.
Thank you so much for having me, John, and I wish all of your students the best of luck in your communications course.
And that marks the end of another episode of Reading and Writing Between the Lines, a podcast hosted by me, John Witzman, on behalf of the Communications Department and School of Interdisciplinary Studies at Conestoga College. You can find other episodes of this series on our YouTube channel, Reading and Writing Between the Lines. Stay tuned for more episodes. Thanks for listening.